In-depth football coverage from The Athletic is now just £1 per week. See the link in the description to sign up today. David Beckham's end at Manchester United was ugly. The slow but steady deterioration of his relationship with Sir Alex Ferguson manifested in squabbles, headlines, and famously, a flying boot and a cut above the eyebrow. Beckham had once enjoyed an almost paternal relationship with his manager. But by 2003, his celebrity, his lifestyle, and what Ferguson perceived to be his dwindling focus had conspired to create a brooding hostility. So having previously been assumed unsellable, the England captain was suddenly on the market. And this is the story of how and why Real Madrid pounced. When Florentino Perez was elected to the Real Madrid presidency for the first time in 2000, he inherited a club in a mess. Real were nearly €280 million in debt, and despite having just won the Champions League for the second time in 3 seasons, they had become ideologically dull. And the Galactico era was the response to that. It was also inspired by Perez's rejection of team-building orthodoxies and his belief in the primacy of talent alone. But it was fundamentally an attempt to twine the club around the notion of fantasy, with the aim of becoming football's biggest spectacle. First, it needed the right players. Perez had been elected on a pledge to sign Luis Figo from Barcelona. If he failed, he'd promised to pay for the entire year's worth of season tickets out of his own pocket. Figo signed, of course, and would be followed by Zinedine Zidane in 2001 and Brazilian forward Ronaldo in 2002. It was optimistic and aspirational. More than anything, it was highly seductive, and while the football could often be flawed, it was fabulous just as often. As a result, whatever else the Galacticos era may have been, and whatever its tactical deficiencies were, it naturally spoke to the ego of the world's best players. Perez created a stage on which they wanted to perform. So, given Beckham's image and ease with the spotlight, to say nothing of the chance to play with Raúl, Figo, Zidane and Ronaldo, it naturally caught his eye. And the courtship between him and Real was relatively smooth, even though it depended on the growing hostility at Old Trafford. Tension between Beckham and Ferguson had been brewing for some time, but 2003 was the point of no return. Following a 2-0 loss to Arsenal, the two would have their famous flare-up in the dressing room. Ferguson kicked a boot at Beckham, cutting him just above the eye. The photographic evidence was splashed over the British tabloids. Then, 6 weeks later, United faced Real Madrid in a Champions League quarter-final. They'd been badly outplayed in the first leg, losing 3-1, but it was Beckham who paid for the performance with his place, watching on from the bench as Ole Gunnar Solskjaer started on the right wing for the return leg. Beckham would come on, score twice and inspire a dramatic 4-3 win, but it wasn't enough. United were out and Real were sashaying into the semi-final, and did so having piqued Beckham's interest along the way. As ever, the accounts of who contacted who and when are quite vague, but the conversation was initiated by Beckham's representatives in 2003, prior to that second leg. Before the end of the month, Jose Angel Sanchez, who had arrived as marketing director upon Perez's election, would meet with Peter Kenyon, United's CEO, at a European football summit in Belgium. By June, after a meeting in Sardinia, the two would strike an agreement. The price for Beckham would be just under £25 million, not including future fees. According to reports, Perez had been prepared to pay more than double. Given the £54 million he'd spent on Luis Figo, the nearly £70 million on Zidane, and the $40 he'd parted for Ronaldo, all in successive summers, that seems fair to assume. From Real's perspective, it was strangely easy, or at least it was after one unexpected road bump. Prior to Sanchez and Kenyon reaching their agreement, United had released a statement announcing that an agreement had been brokered with Joan Laporta, a candidate in the upcoming Barcelona presidential election. Real were bemused, but Beckham was furious, and a retaliatory statement from his representatives announced that he had no intention of meeting with Laporta or Barcelona, and that he felt as if he was being used as a political pawn. Even now, almost 2 decades later, it's a difficult episode to explain or justify. And the relatively low fee agreed with Real also suggests a mistake by United. Years later, Beckham would own some of the responsibility for how his career in England ended, but regardless of whether Ferguson was right to sell him or not, his determination to be rid of the player likely weakened the club's bargaining position. Without question, the fee was low for the game's most saleable asset, but if Manchester United weren't aware of what they were giving up, Real was certainly sure of what they were getting. In April of 2003, The Guardian reported that the club were conducting market research on Beckham's commercial appeal, and the conclusion was compelling. Not only was he an obvious commodity within the game and the footballing face of Adidas, but he also promoted tangentially related products like Pepsi, Vodafone, Brylcreem and Marks & Spencer, which proved his reach beyond the sport. He was also the first man to appear on the cover of the women's magazine Marie Claire, which demonstrated just how broad his appeal really was. Of particular interest to Perez and Sanchez, though, was Beckham's effect in Asia. Manchester United had long been touring in that part of the world, but the previous summer's World Cup in Japan and South Korea had inspired a local psychosis. Beckham caused a frenzy wherever he went. So, shortly after completing his transfer, Beckham arrived in Japan for a promotional tour. He would be greeted by hundreds of fans at Tokyo Airport, and later a supposedly secret visit to a downtown Adidas store attracted thousands, trapping Beckham inside and disrupting the traffic. He was a star. Even prior to his move, Beckham had endorsed beauty products, engine oil and mobile phones in Asia. In 2002, a confectionery company even built a 10-foot statue of him out of chocolate and displayed it in a Tokyo shopping district. You see, that kind of appeal was precious for Perez and Sanchez, particularly with their ambitions of Asian expansion and their ultimately unrealised attempt to launch a theme park in the Middle East. It provided an immediate dividend too, with the club earning an estimated €10 million from a 2003 pre-season tour which passed through Hong Kong, Bangkok, Beijing and Japan. Also precious was the clause in Beckham's Real contract, standard in all the deals Perez struck with his Galacticos, which entitled the club to a 50% share of his image rights. And that was an image which became more valuable once it was cloaked in Real's famous white shirt. In White Angels, John Carlin's study of the Galactico period, the author describes a conversation with Jesus Gazans, then president of Audi's Spanish division, which provides vivid testament of just how powerful Beckham and Madrid were in concert. In the 36 hours after the transfer was completed, during which Beckham was ferried between his medical and ceremonial appointments in an Audi, the coverage the company received was so substantial, Gazans claimed, as to repay the entire investment made in their 3-year partnership with the club. It's the kind of anecdote which vindicates the Galacticos project, but also unfairly colours Beckham's sporting reputation. Financial results from the time, which show Real Madrid's revenues rising from £93.2 million in 2001 to £186.4 and the top of the Deloitte money list by 2005, also depict him quite wrongly as a convenient signing made solely with commercial imperatives in mind. That's especially true given that he would win just one La Liga title in his 4 years in Spain. But that's really to misunderstand David Beckham, or to fail to recognise the rare balance that he struck between the sporting and commercial worlds. It's also to misinterpret what the intention of the Galactico project was, or why Beckham was so integral to its concept. That period of Real Madrid's history may not have been laden with silverware, but it still produced a financial revolution, as well as the spectacle and sense of fantasy that Florentino Perez had dreamt of restoring. Tifo is delighted to be able to offer full access to The Athletic now for just £1 per week. Read in-depth coverage of your favourite teams across 10 different sports, provided by some of the best sports journalists in the world. Follow the stories that you care about with closer access and intelligent takes. Whether it's sports news, tactics or finances, you'll find it all on The Athletic, alongside a host of brilliant podcasts dedicated to different teams. So, see the link in the description now. Thanks for supporting TiVo and of course watching today's video.